The German artist Käthe Kollwitz made this lithograph self-portrait in 1934, when she was 67 years old. It's both bold and heartbreaking, but it's pretty much the face you'd expect from an artist who had witnessed and experienced the horrors of the first half of the 20th century, and who believed she had an obligation to record that horror with compassion, but without any sentimentality. There's no sentimentality in this portrait, no vanity. She's an old woman, and she draws herself so close up that you see every wrinkle, the sagging jowls, and the deep dark circles and bags under her eyes. Her eyes are so deep set, they look like they're at the back of caves, but the eyes are what pull you into the picture. In some ways, they look confrontational, forbidding in the way they stare at you, but they're also compassionate. I think she's showing you her suffering that's been physically etched on her face over the years, and she's inviting you to share in the common human experience of suffering. She was born Käthe Schmidt in Königsberg in East Prussia. Her family was both politically and religiously radical, and she grew up around family discussions about social justice. Her father supported equality for women, which was important, because when his daughter showed talent, he encouraged her, and later sent her to a girls' art school in Berlin. Universities and art academies were not open to women. In 1891, the same year she painted this self-portrait, she married Käthe Kollwitz, a doctor who treated factory workers. The Kollwitzes lived in a small apartment near the factory in Prenzlauer Berg, which at the time was a densely populated neighborhood made up of tenements and breweries. Käthe set up a small studio in a room across from her husband's office, where she drew his patients and other people in the neighborhood. She explained that she drew them not out of sympathy, but because she admired their guts, and she thought their courage was beautiful. Kollwitz's first major work was a cycle of 6 prints called A Weaver's Revolt. It was based on a play about an 1844 uprising of weavers who were fighting for higher wages and better working conditions. Kollwitz's work doesn't illustrate the play, though. She has her own narrative about the rebellion, which starts with the experience of poverty and death that fueled the need for revolution. It moves on to a depiction of the plot against the bosses. The weavers march to the mansion of the employer they plan to attack, the attack itself, and finally, the inevitable defeat of the weavers' rebellion, which Kollwitz shows in a scene of a body being carried into a dark room, already lined with the dead. The most powerful of the prints is the March of the Weavers. It's a battle scene, or at least a before-the-battle scene. But there's no sense of heroism or even the chaos of battle in it. The figures all lean forward, slightly to the right, which gives you a sense of forward momentum, but the cuts go in the opposite direction, as if pulling them back. These aren't soldiers anxious for glory. They're ordinary people. They aren't carrying weapons, they're carrying tools. And the most prominent figure is a woman carrying a sleeping child, not something we're used to seeing in a visual representation of fighting. There's a feeling of resignation in the picture. The weavers don't expect to win. They're just doing what they have to do. I think the composition adds to this effect. It's basically 2 rectangles. The upper fourth, above the horizon line, is almost entirely negative space. The rectangle on the bottom, filled with the weavers, is darker, and it's made to look darker still by comparison with the light space above them. The weavers are a dark mass, and the band of light above actually seems to weigh down on them. The horizon itself pushes them down. I'd like to take a moment to talk about the medium Kollwitz used. She was trained as a painter and did quite a bit of sculpture toward the end of her life, but she's primarily known as a printmaker. There's a practical reason for this, a political reason, and an artistic reason. The practical reason is a matter of space. In 1920, she became the first female professor at the Prussian Academy of Arts, and her position included a large studio to work in. But before that, she worked in whatever tiny rooms she could find, and never had enough space to work on large-scale canvases. Drawing and painting were small scale and took up less space. The second reason is that prints can be reproduced many times. Kollwitz was always concerned with the political and social justice aspects of her art. When she worked for a specific cause, as she did in this lithograph, which she made in 1923, to be used internationally as a flyer to publicize the desperate conditions in Germany after World War I, she obviously wanted her work to be seen by as many people as possible. But even when she was doing political but not propaganda work, like her Weaver cycle, she believed art should be for everyone, not just the rich. She deliberately did not sign many of her prints in order to make them less valuable and bring down the cost, so that working people could own copies. The third reason was an artistic choice. Käthe Kollwitz's subject matter was almost always somber. She dealt with hunger, pain, injustice, and death. Her work isn't entirely monochromatic. There are touches of color here and there. But the starkness of the deep black that ink gave her, combined with the amazing range of middle tone grays that she was able to get because she was such a master of her craft, that was extremely well suited to the bleakness of her subject matter. Returning to the Weavers, it's interesting that the first 3 prints in the series are lithographs. The final 3 are etchings. In her autobiography, Kollwitz said that she wanted 6 etchings, but when she started the work, she hadn't yet mastered the craft. If you look at one of her lithographs and one of her etchings from the same series, you can see what different effects they have. The lithograph is basically a drawing done on limestone with an oily pencil that ink sticks to. It's covered with a material that resists ink, so that when you stamp it on paper, only the drawn part is reproduced. It gives you a beautiful blend from one value to another. So here, there's a bright light around the face of the child. The child almost looks like the source of light, and that light spreads out, a little bit diminished, to the grieving mother, and then it slowly fades away until there's nothing but blackness in the background. The light focuses all your attention on the mother and the child and the mother's grief. One thing I noticed in this print is that there's an implied triangle created by the light, which goes from the corner of the child's pillow to the top of the mother's head, and then back down to the bottom of the bed. That triangular composition was common in Renaissance portraits of the Madonna and Child, and I think this print is connecting with that tradition, giving the mother's sorrow religious connotations. The etching, on the other hand, involves carving all the details into a metal plate and then applying ink in the grooves. It's a more difficult process, but it gives the artist the possibility of showing a lot more detail. The delicacy of the wrought iron in the employer's gate and the swirled wall carvings make a sharp contrast with the heavy mass of the weavers. If you look closely at the wall, you can see a stippling effect, which Kollwitz got by sandpapering her metal plate. The lithograph focuses on one powerful emotion. The etching is able to capture a lot of action and fine detail. Kollwitz's next major work was another series of prints based on a historical event, an unsuccessful 16th century peasants' revolt. In 7 prints, Kollwitz shows the abuses of feudalism, preparations for battle, the battle itself, and finally the inevitable defeat, which shows a woman searching among the bodies on the battlefield and prisoners waiting to be executed. The technical proficiency of these prints is amazing. As you can see in this detail from the battlefield, she shows a dramatic command of light and shadow that has the same emotional power as her lithographs. At the same time, the detail of the veins in the hands of the woman touching a dead child's face is both poignant and astonishingly skilled. Contemporary critics called her work masculine, and they meant it as a compliment, referring both to her serious subject matter and her astounding craft. This is ironic on a lot of levels. First, because so much art by women has been denigrated as craft, not art, when it involved working with fiber or fabric. Metal was supposedly a man's material, and therefore it seemed somehow surprising that a woman had mastered it. Also, her subject matter, scenes of battle, had always belonged to male artists. But if you look at the Peasants' War, you see women both as victims of war and, in this print, as a heroic figure, Black Anna, leading the charge. There was nothing especially masculine about Käthe Kollwitz's work. She just claimed a subject matter that had belonged exclusively to men and showed it from a woman's point of view, and included women among the heroes. Käthe Kollwitz had two sons. As a child, her older son, Hans, almost died from diphtheria. Shortly after, she made this etching of a woman holding her dead child. She used herself and her younger son, Peter, as models. I think it's one of the most moving images I've ever seen. She uses a triangular composition again, which makes you think of a Pietà, but the woman's leg juts out of the composition, throwing everything off balance. The lines of arms and legs weave around in chaotic ways. The clearest thing in the picture is the woman's hand, dead center on the page, darker and more detailed than anything else. It's the focal point, and it looks like one last attempt to hold on to the child who is already fading away. What makes this picture even more heartbreaking is the history that followed. In 1914, Peter wanted to enlist in the military, but was underage. Kollwitz convinced her husband to sign the papers that allowed him to enlist. 10 days after leaving home, Peter died in battle in Belgium. Kollwitz wasn't just grief-stricken. For the rest of her life, she was racked with guilt. Although her next cycle of prints explored the subject of war, there's not a single battlefield image in it. Instead, Kollwitz focused on the effect of war on those left behind, like this new mother in the first print. She isn't cradling her baby, she's offering it up to an all-encompassing military, symbolized by the black coat that surrounds her, with military piping on the sleeve. In this series, Kollwitz began working with a different kind of printmaking, woodblock printing. Intaglio printing, including etching, allowed Kollwitz to show great detail and complexity. Relief printing has a more primitive look, but Kollwitz uses it to portray a single emotion in the most compact and striking way possible. This image of grieving parents is one of nothing but pain. Their bodies are flat, their faces are invisible. They're simply coiled into each other in pain, and the inked cuts that crisscross their bodies come across as literal cuts, like open, never-healing wounds. The war cycle has two woodcuts titled The Widow. In the first, the widow is left entirely alone in her grief. I think the heavy ink is used really effectively here, because it makes her body into a flat block of sorrow. It closes in on her. Her face is like a mask. Her gnarled hands are in the position of holding someone who isn't there. The blackness focuses your eye on her gesture, but it also symbolizes a darkness she can never escape from. In the second print, the widow holds an infant, but both of them are limp. They show very little sign of life. And once again, that heavy blackness is used very effectively to show the eternal weight of their loss. The flat blackness takes on a double meaning in the print of the mothers. It makes the women into a solid block, unified by their grief. But it also gives them weight and strength as they hide the children they still have from further wars. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Kollwitz lost her professorship at the Prussian Academy, along with the only studio she had ever had. The Gestapo threatened to send her and her husband to a concentration camp if they didn't reveal the names of other anti-fascist artists. Her fame, both in Germany and internationally, probably saved her life. In 1942, her grandson, also named Peter, was killed at the Russian front. She died in 1945, only weeks before the end of the war. She experienced an almost unimaginable amount of pain in her life, and her prints are the haunting record of it.